All right, chapter 6, leading people from our Powell textbook. Do women make better bosses? Have you had an experience with a female boss, male boss? If you've never had a job, perhaps you can think about your experience with sports or with scouting or just in government in general, what you've observed in our government. Do women make better bosses? Is that question tainted in and of itself? Does the question assume that one sex is better than the other in management roles? When we say is one thing better than the other, does that not automatically mean that the other is less than? So if we said, are girls smarter than boys? Does that automatically make you say that one is better than the other? When of course, in reality, we know that no, neither gender is smarter. It depends on the person, correct? So if I said, are cats better than dogs or dogs better than cats? Well, in my house, everyone will tell you that dogs are better than cats. Well, in reality, we're all allergic to cats. It has nothing to do with the animal themselves. It has to do with our own personal situation. Therefore, when we ask a question, do women make better bosses? Is this a form of dualism? Are we taking there's only two options here, and one has to be good. Therefore, do we have to assign bad or less than to the other? So this question in and of itself is kind of tainted, because in reality, of course, you can't say if men or women make a better boss, because it depends on the person. So in a 2006 poll, when people were asked what their preference was, male or female, for a leader, here are the results. Now, this is all Americans. This is what men answered. This is what women answered. So, look how many women answered that they prefer a male boss as opposed to a female boss. Now, there's a lot of things to look at in here, but I thought that that was one of the most interesting. Now, this is for the answer, no preference. I don't care if it's male or female. I just want a good boss. Interesting, yes? Look at men and look at women. Very interesting how we might interpret what women are saying about women in leadership. Ask yourself the question, do you prefer a male or a female boss? And if we take away the boss and we say leadership, then we can morph it into other things. Do people in our country prefer a male or a female president? What does history tell you? There has never been a female president. Have we ever had on the ticket a female candidate for president from either of the top two parties, which of course is Democrat and Republican? And the answer is no, we have not. We have had vice presidential female candidates. Notice that they've never been elected, by the way. We have not had that female candidate on there as a presidential candidate for either Democrats or the Republicans. So, interesting to take a look at this. Interpret what you will, but definitely take a look at your own life and see how this correlates to your own life. And you might even ask people around you, ask your family members, ask people you work with. You would be surprised at some of the answers you get and the vehemence with how some people answer this question. All right, so as we continue to explore the possible explanations for why that poll came out as it did, some of the explanations have to do with stereotypes, yes? Stereotypes suggesting that leaders are more effective if they display characteristics associated with males rather than females. And remember, stereotypes often lead to prejudice, yes? Therefore, female leaders may be the victim of prejudicial beliefs held by their followers, who will simply assume that they are going to act in a certain way or not act in a certain way. Differences in typical male and female leadership behaviors and results from these behaviors are always tainted by people's prejudging by the beliefs that they already hold, rather than judging the person based on their behavior. How much do we judge them based on what we think their behavior should be, or might be, or is going to be, or should not be? One of the things that's very interesting is age does appear to play a role in sex preference for leaders. Younger workers are less likely to have a preference for one sex over the other than older workers. Now, therefore, we could assume that sex bias and leadership preferences should diminish over time. The older the worker, the more likely in these surveys they were to have a preference to have a male leader. The younger the person, the more likely they were to say, I don't care about their gender, I care about their leadership capabilities. And again, this could come from the younger the person is, the more likely they are to have experienced a female in a leadership role. Therefore, the older a person is, the less likely they are to have experienced a female as their superior. And if they did at that time in our society, it could have been seen as a very negative thing. So age does appear to affect how the poll comes out and who has no preference in gender and says, I just want a good leader. All right, taking a look at gender stereotypes in leadership. Virginia Shine in the 1970s developed a list of 92 characteristics that people commonly believed distinguish between men and women. Using these characteristics, Shine surveyed middle managers from U.S. corporations. It is important to note that was U.S., not international, and asked them to identify the characteristics they believed a good manager should possess. Both males and females listed the attributes associated with male behaviors as those a good manager should possess. So interesting that both men and women saw male stereotypical behavior as being positive in a manager. More recent studies show that women are less inclined to associate good management with male stereotypical behavior. However, the typical mindset is definitely still think manager and think male. Basically, manager traits are male traits is what that's saying. And that is, particularly when you start looking at international information, surveys, polls, and studies rather than strictly in the U.S., definitely when you start looking at other countries, you're going to find more and more evidence that think manager, think male still exists. Now, Butterfield and Powell, Powell being our text author, surveyed part-time MBA students. Now, when someone is a part-time MBA student, that generally means they are full-time employed, and full-time undergrad business students, utilizing the BEM sex role inventory to describe themselves. So they had their MBA students and their full-time undergrad students use the BSRI to describe themselves and then what they viewed as a good manager. Now, the researchers hypothesized that the survey would result in an androgynous model, that this whole think manager, think male would be gone. However, the results showed that male characteristics still prevailed. They were very surprised to find out that these students still held male stereotypes as something that is considered the penultimate, the ultimate wonderful behaviors of a manager. The stereotype that good leaders are male puts females pursuing leadership roles at a distinct disadvantage. Displaying widely held female stereotypical behavior means it will not be viewed as leadership material, yet evidencing traditional male behaviors means they're not accepted because they're not conforming to the traditional gender roles. It's that catch-22. Remember, we talked about we don't like it when people behave radically outside of their gender stereotypical roles as set by our society. So in order to be a good manager, okay, studies show us people expect male behaviors. Yet studies also show us that we don't like women who evidence stereotypical male behaviors. So how does a female become viewed as a good leader? This incongruity, think male in order to be a leader, but still behave with traditional female stereotypical behaviors, may actually dissuade females from even trying to obtain leadership positions. The mindset that typical male behaviors define a good leader may also lead selection away from female candidates. It may also lead women to receive lower performance evaluations than their male counterparts. If male behaviors are desirable for a good manager, yet we don't want women to behave outside of their societal-driven gender stereotypes, then how can women be judged fairly in the position of manager? Again, it is that total catch-22. You need to behave like this male, the males do, to be an effective leader, but don't you dare act like a man if you're a woman. So it actually, the effect can be that it tends to cause women not to even bother to try for leadership roles, because it's always men. Men always get them. They're the ones in this particular organization that always get those roles. And in the actual selection committee can cause the same thing. No, it's always when you don't have a role model, and it's, therefore you form, when we talked about forming prototypes in your head, therefore if there's never been a female effective manager and they say, okay, we're going to go hire a manager, it is entirely possible that the prototype in your head is male, which means the females could encounter barriers in the selection process. A 1965 survey of male executives who were asked how they viewed women in management showed that 41% of male executives viewed women in management unfavorably, while 35% of male executives viewed women in management favorably. And what could cause these attitudes? They say that part of it was actually women's full-on acceptance of exclusion from managerial positions, that they just literally accepted it and didn't even bother to fight it. And the other part could have been the societal prejudice at that time against women working outside of the home. Remember, we're talking the 1960s, still very much a situation where women should be home raising the children, particularly if they were young children. So those two things together could definitely have skewed people's attitudes towards women in management. All right, so we just talked about the survey in 1965. Now here's one in 2005. In 2005, 88% of male executives viewed women in management favorably. 71% of male executives would feel comfortable working for a woman when the woman is their superior. That's huge. Overall, just a more positive male outlook on female executives. So definitely moving in the right direction. However, when you're talking about executives, remember that generally speaking, you are talking about people over 45 years old, could be in their earlier 40s, but we'll say over 40. Remember what we talked about how the younger they are, the more accepting they are of not just women in management overall, but having a female superior. So this is actually an extremely high number that people who are executives would feel comfortable with a woman as their superior, and that is a tremendous positive jump and definitely a move in the right direction. When we start examining the attitudes in field research and lab studies about people towards female leaders, it's very interesting. Female leaders are devalued relative to male leaders when the females use stereotypically masculine leadership styles. Again, people don't like it when you step out of society's prescribed gender role for you, or if they occupied a leadership role in a traditionally male-intensive occupation where before them everybody was male, it's a male-intensive occupation, females are very much the minority. Okay, that woman in leadership there would be devalued. And where they were valued expressly by males. Okay, subordinates expressed similar satisfaction between male and female managers, but they had a more positive experience with female managers when they had actually worked for one. And that is something really interesting about all of these studies. We're asking everyone how they feel about female managers, but the question is, have you ever actually worked for one? People who have actually worked for one, have actually had the experience of being supervised by a woman, have more positive attitudes towards women leaders. Actually working for a woman helps dispel many of the stereotypes that are assigned to female leaders. So the more common it becomes for you to have a female subordinate, then the idea is the more positive women will be viewed in leadership roles. Okay, when we start talking about leader behaviors, task style refers to organizing and designing how the jobs of the department will actually be completed. For example, the manager develops job descriptions, they set department and individual goals, they assign work projects, and they define how the work is to be accomplished. That is task oriented. Whereas interpersonal style refers to how the manager interacts with the employees. Praise and reward are examples of a manager's interpersonal style. How do they maintain or improve morale? How do they show their appreciation for the subordinates' efforts, and do they express their appreciation effectively? A manager can be very proficient at both task and interpersonal styles, or high in one and low in another, or even, unfortunately, low in both. Democratic decision making means taking into consideration the opinions of subordinates, while autocratic style decision making does not allow for the subordinates to have any influence on the decisions made by the leader. These two types of decision making styles are considered opposites. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of my favorite part of the chapter, which is leadership theories. Particularly situational leadership theory by Hersey Blanchard. Situational leadership theory states that the manager's behaviors must be adjusted to the maturity level of the subordinate. Okay, so Hersey Blanchard in 1999 suggested that leaders should adapt their style to follower development style or maturity based on how ready and willing the follower is to perform required tasks. That is, their competence and motivation. So really, really interesting when you start looking at Hersey Blanchard and their leadership theories, that it's situational and that you cannot apply the same behaviors to each employee. Okay? It depends when they are still very immature, and that does not mean age, by the way. This means how developed they are as an employee. Okay, the manager or the leader may have to start out with both high task and high interpersonal behaviors towards their employees, both constantly ensuring they know what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and then praising them when they do it well. And as the employee matures and grows, they can switch to a more low task where they don't have to direct every little thing they do and micromanage them, that they can trust the employee to know what they should be doing, how they should be doing, and that they will do it, but still with high interpersonal, making sure they're getting praised, that they're getting the self-esteem and the reward that they need. And then eventually, hopefully, the employee will mature to the point and have enough organizational commitment that the manager can actually go low task, low interpersonal, and that you can trust your people to do their work, and that the manager can focus on other leadership responsibilities rather than constantly watching the employees. So in the idea of situational leadership from Hersey Blanchard is you want to move your employees through these different rankings basically, and no one is exactly the same, and a good leader knows how to adjust this and when they can get off the high task, because by the way, that's not something you want to do. That's an employee that is not mature, it's not developing when you constantly have to watch them, and that takes away the leader's ability to focus on long-range goals for the organization when they're constantly having to oversee these people. You really want to move your people to the point where they are low task, You may, and some people always have to have a high interpersonal, that's just their makeup. But again, a good leader knows which one of their employees will, even when they make it to low task, will have to have that high interpersonal. And for most leaders, the ultimate employee, of course, is that low task, low interpersonal, where you can just trust them to do their work. You don't have to baby them. You don't have to pat them too much. Everyone needs some motivation and some praise, but you don't have to focus on it as much. And that frees the manager up to be able to do other duties, which is, of course, one of our goals. Now, your book put Tannenbaum and Schmidt after Hersey Blanchard, but truthfully, Tannenbaum and Schmidt was, they developed this theory in the 1950s, which Hersey Blanchard based part of their theory upon. So I left it in the order your book had it, but truthfully, Tannenbaum and Schmidt was in 1958. They identified three forces that led to the leader's action: the forces in the situation, the forces in the follower, and the forces in the leader. This recognizes that the leader's style is highly variable, or situational is what Hersey Blanchard calls it, and even distant events such as a family argument can lead to issues, a more aggressive stance. Everything is always situational. Again, that when I start saying situational, that harkens back to Hersey Blanchard. But Tannenbaum and Schmidt said develop a more democratic and less autocratic decision-making style as your subordinates need more independence. They're ready to assume more responsibility, and they become able to solve problems as a team. And this is true. Employees develop. They're completely different from the time when you first get them, and I hope, as you move them through your organization, and it comes to the point where you do need more independence, and you do not want your leader over your shoulder all the time. You expect them to trust you, and you become ready to assume more and more responsibility, yes? So these two theories actually kind of work hand in hand. And Tannenbaum and Schmidt, again, is part of what led to Hersey Blanchard's theory of situational leadership. Okay, now we're going to talk about transformational versus transactional leadership. Transformational leadership is often referred to as leading from the center. This is sometimes called the web of inclusion. The idea that instead of a traditional top-down hierarchy that puts the leader at the top of the pyramid and then the followers underneath the leader, the transformational leader leads from the center, and each portion of the organization is dependent upon the others. Think of a spider web. Each portion depends on the other for support. If a portion collapses, then the entire web is in danger. Therefore, the organization is only as strong as the sum of its parts, not necessarily only as strong as its leader. Does that make sense? So, I mean, it's bad because, you know, spiders are usually associated as something nasty. I don't care for them myself, but this is like a little diagram to kind of show you the idea of how each one of these parts of the organization is dependent upon the other. And if any of these starts to break, it weakens the rest of the web. And these are relationships between your organization, okay? You have to have the relationships. And again, we've talked before about the us versus them thing that happens sometimes in organizations. This is the exact opposite. There is no us versus them. It's all us, right? One of the goals of transformational leaders is to turn their followers into leaders. Rather than the idea of the top-down hierarchy where there's only room at the tippy top of the pyramid for a very small amount, transformational leadership says, no, there's room for all of us, and I want to develop people into leaders. When the leader, the head dog, whatever you want to call him, develops their followers into leaders, rather than taking away the top leader's power, it actually strengthens it when you can depend more upon your subordinates to step up and take more responsibility. Transformational leaders exhibit more charisma, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, individualized consideration, very much more the idea of the person that knows their people, their organization, rather than the person in that ivory tower who never comes out. You know, I remember working for a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation, and one of the top vice presidents was known for going down into the cafeteria, flipping his badge around so that you couldn't see his name or his title, and then eating his lunch in the cafeteria, just walking up to a table and asking if he could sit down with some of the employees, chatting them up, finding out what's really going on, never telling them who he was. And he was also known, it was this particular organization was a manufacturing organization, so it ran 24 hours a day. He was known to do that on all shifts, just show up in the middle of the night when the third shift, the latest shift people would be taking their meal time. And again, just going in, making sure no one could see that badge, sitting down and saying, hey, how's it going? To find out what's really happening. So there's no filtering through managers underneath him, right? You could talk directly to the source, ask those employees, are you happy? What's going on? How can we make this better? Very much a transformational form of leadership rather than transactional leaders. And this is a little diagram of what a transactional leadership looks like. Now, obviously, in a large corporation, there would be many more layers, but the idea is that the lowest level workers are down here, and if we pick them off, the base is still strong. Whereas if we pick this person off, oh, we can't do that. We can't lose this one person because it's not a web we're all dependent upon each other. It's got a very different shape, doesn't it? So transactional leaders tend to work from, and if you go on in your education, you're going to learn something called zero-sum power, and the idea there's only so much and it shouldn't be shared, because if I share my power with you, then I have less, which is a transactional idea, as opposed to a transformational idea that says power should be shared. So when we look at transactional leadership, it's a traditional top-down hierarchy with that leader at the tippy top and the workers are beneath. I'm going to give you a kind of a silly example, but it's kind of fun. It's hyperbole, I know, but think about to the old Flintstones cartoons. Think Mr. Slade and Fred Flintstone. Can you hear in those cartoons Slade yelling Flintstone? And Fred being very much afraid of Mr. Slade, always worried about doing the wrong thing that will cause him to lose his job. You know, I know it's silliness, but it drives home the idea of transactional management and the stereotypical transactional leader. The workers have to be heavily monitored for errors. If they do their job well, you know, well, that's what they're supposed to do, and your reward is your paycheck. If you don't do the job well, then you're in trouble. Transformational leaders, that's the other type we're talking about, can at times need to be transactional, depending on the circumstances, but transactional leaders seldom exhibit the behaviors of transformational leaders. A transactional leader is that person that stays up here and doesn't want to see these people and doesn't want to hear about them, and he doesn't hear about them unless there's a problem. They exhibit behaviors like contingent reward. The only way you get any form of reward is if you do something special, way above those objectives. Management by exception, looking for mistakes. Very much a passive and reactionary form of management as opposed to a very active and proactive form of management. There are times when transactional management, this top-down hierarchy, is appropriate. In fact, it's required. And the example I would give you would be a surgeon in an operating room. A surgeon in an operating room has to be in charge. You have to have their orders adhered to instantly. I think if you were the patient, you wouldn't want just in a normal situation, the subordinates talking back and going, "You're really sure you want to cut there? Are we sure this is," you know? Now, in a life-saving situation, obviously that surgeon would be barking out orders, and that's necessary, right? However, that's not to say that their subordinates could ever not point something out, because they certainly could in an emergency situation, but generally speaking, the surgeon is in charge. The other thing we could look at would be a military situation in war, in the actual in the war zone. Again, the person who is in charge has to be obeyed immediately. There can't, "Are you sure we really want to shoot that way?" No. There's no room for that, is there? So there are times when transactional leadership is necessary. However, it can't be at all times. And even, if you look at military organizations, definitely at other times the leaders use a form of transformational leadership, and their subordinates have a chance to give their input on certain decisions. But again, it's situational and depends. And there are times when transactional forms of leadership are imperative and can save lives. But in the average business on a day-to-day basis, that is not the truth. And you cannot continue with strictly transactional forms of leadership at all times. Definitely in the average, normal, everyday, no one's life is on the line type of business, transformational is the type of leadership that's the most effective. Now we're going to talk about the laissez-faire form of leadership. And again, that's, my French is not good, but that is pronounced laissez-faire. Laissez-faire form of leadership is really not much leadership at all. This is also known as free reign. Just get the job done. Don't bother me with the details. Don't talk to me about it. I just want to know that it's done. It's also considered an absentee form of leadership. Let's take these three different forms of leadership, transactional, transformational, and laissez-faire, and apply it, say, to something like parenting. All right, so you want your kid to eat carrots for dinner. A transactional form of leadership is eat your carrots or you'll be punished. Why do I have to eat the carrots? Because I said so. A transformational form of leadership is eat the carrots. Why? Because they're good for you. Why? Because the doctor said that they have vitamin A, and honey, you need vitamin A, and I need you to eat your carrots. Okay. One is very much just do what I said because I said so. One is I will explain it to you, and if you are the transformational parent I am, there will also be some dealing going on with how many carrots and how many bites. A laissez-faire parent says, yeah, you should eat something orange for dinner. Did you? Yes. And they have the Cheeto dust on their hands and say, I sure did. Okay, good. Didn't pay any attention at all. The kid's full. The kid's not complaining. But the parent doesn't even realize that they ate Cheetos instead of carrot sticks. Okay, so again, kind of a silly example, but you get the idea of the three different types. The laissez-faire person just avoids taking responsibility. They don't give directions. They don't want to involve themselves. If you stop right now and you go to your personal form, now remember, we're not going to use the email anymore because I still have some nightmares about that. You go to your personal form and you post a thread with the subject line situational. You'll earn your points for the week. Please remember, I'm not going to open that. Just like the emails, I don't open it. I just look at the date that you have the right word, and I mark down the points. So that's going to be our new fabulous way to do that so that everyone gets their points, and I don't have upset people and lost points and insanity and pounding my head against the desk because that really hurts. So to your personal form, a thread, subject line, situational. Get your points. All right. Successful organizations are shifting more towards transformational, democratic leadership styles. I did that in this class. I am required to have you do a group project that is so difficult for online students. So what did I do? I put up a question that said, how would you do this if you were the teacher in an online class? Basically, how would you do this? And then I read every word you guys said, took notes, and set up a group project for you based on what you told me. So it can be used at all times. Now, do I have to have transactional in there? Of course I do. There has to be due dates, there has to be rules, and I have to enforce them. But will I do my best to listen to your input and try to make something that maybe you don't want to eat the carrots, but you have to because it's good for you, and I'm required to do that, and to make it a little bit more palatable, I give you the ability to kind of help design it for yourself? Absolutely. There are times when you can, in every aspect of your life, depending on what you're managing, utilize the transformational forms of leadership. When we start looking more at these gender stereotypes and leadership theories, I want to emphasize that we are talking about stereotypes. And stereotypes are not necessarily reality, are they? Remember that we learned that one of the reasons that stereotypes perpetuates can be that they may hold some thread of truth from a singular event in a person's life, or they can exist as a form of laziness. It's just easier to lump people into pre-assigned categories rather than take the time to study and think and consider each situation on its own. It's just so much easier to say, oh, women are so much more emotional, and just move on, and that explains why you got a bad evaluation from your female supervisor. Remember, these are stereotypes that we were talking about all through this chapter. Situational leadership suggests that adopting masculine, androgynous, feminine, and undifferentiated roles as subordinates mature. In other words, it's situational. It depends on the situation. Do you need to use what are traditional male stereotypes? Do you need a combination of the two, which is androgynous, or do you need to use what is a traditional feminine or female gender stereotype behaviors? It all depends on the situation. Autocratic leadership depends on adopting masculine stereotypes, dominance, control. Think about firefighters in the midst of the fire. Again, they have to use an autocratic form of leadership. Democratic decision making, more of a consensus style, which is considered more the feminine stereotype. Please remember, these are stereotypes. It is not necessarily the reality in your own life, which is more of an emphasis on involvement of others. Tannenbaum and Schmidt suggest an increasingly feminine manner of leadership, and I really don't like to talk about it and say feminine manner because so many males are like, well, I don't want to act like a girl. Well, no, that's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is, if you look at what people consider the feminine stereotypical roles in leadership, that's what we're talking about. Those behaviors are not necessarily really feminine. It's just that they've been associated as a feminine stereotype. So no, you don't have to wear a skirt to work tomorrow. You don't have to cry, and you don't have to bake cookies for everybody, although bringing cookies is always a good idea. The idea is taking the best of what's considered feminine stereotypes and using them when appropriate, and women taking the best of male stereotypical behavior and using it when appropriate. So again, my emphasis is always on Hersey Blanchard, which is it's always situational. That's because I am an organizational behavior teacher. I teach at other schools a lot of org behavior, and just for future reference, if you ever go into an organizational behavior class and your instructor starts asking you questions, you should always preface your answer with, well, it's situational, and then give your answer, because in org behavior, especially when you're using a ton of Hersey Blanchard theory, it is always situational. And isn't that true in life? In everything you do, isn't it always situational? It depends. Sometimes you have to yell, and the word have to in there, you have to yell, and sometimes you absolutely should not. It depends. And it depends on the person you're dealing with. Some people, some of your subordinates someday that you have working for you need that strong, masculine, stereotypical behavior for you to guide them. Others need absolutely not. If you did that, they'd cry, they'd crumble, they wouldn't perform as well. You have to use what's considered the traditional female stereotype and be a little more gentle with them and suggest things more gently rather than getting up in their face and demanding. Again, it's just situational, and it's androgynous. You're pulling from both sides depending on the situation, yes? It always depends on the person you're dealing with and the situation at hand. So that's just a basic overview of when we start looking at leadership theories. When we start looking at sex differences in leadership behavior, again, we have to study it. It's very important, and yet I always preface it with, you have to be careful that simply by asking the questions about the differences that you aren't creating dualism and a total us against them type situation. But when we do study sex differences in leadership styles, women rate higher in democratic leadership, transformational leadership dimensions, contingent reward dimension, which is actually transactional but rewarding based on something that was done. Men rate higher on laissez-faire leadership, which I find kind of funny. Passive management by exception. you know, laissez-faire leadership and management by exception. Management by exception, remember, is looking for mistakes and correcting, but failing to reward because your reward is your paycheck and you're supposed to do that type of attitude, which is negatively associated with it. It decreases effectiveness. But again, I mean, I don't want you to look at this slide and go, well, they're saying women are awesome and men are not, because it simply isn't true. Okay, it is not. It's just that there are differences, and here they are. And sometimes some of these differences are good in some situations and not in others. Why? Because it's always, say it, situational. All right, promoting effective leadership. What can organizations do to promote effective leadership? Confront those prejudices. Remember that most people are good people, and we talked about this. And if you say, do you hold any prejudices? We're all going to say no. Yes, we all do. And most people don't like to hear that. It makes them feel bad about themselves. So it always needs to be couched in such a way. Like I'll tell you stories about where I've been prejudiced, where I've told you stories about boys coming into, teenage boys coming into a particular class, and I assumed because of their age and their gender that they were going to be bad. And I was completely wrong. Confronting prejudices in a non-judgmental way, explaining to everyone that they have them, giving examples of your own, asking people to come out with examples of where it might be happening in their lives, and then confronting the prejudice against leaders on the basis of their sex. And you could throw in their gender, race, religion, anything you want. Evaluate leaders on the basis of task accomplishment, group cohesiveness, and development of subordinates, not just on task accomplishment, but hitting more than that, because task accomplishment is no longer enough if your people are leaving your organization, correct? So it needs to be evaluated, people need to be evaluated more than just task accomplishment. Publicize the qualifications of individuals assigned to a leader position. This is important. People need to know why you're qualified to teach what you teach. I came into this class, I asked you to put up your personal introduction with a little bio. I went pretty light on mine, asked for some silly stuff. You know, it just depends on the class I'm teaching. If I'm going to go in and teach a grad school class, no. You're not going to hear about my 100-pound poodle. You're going to hear about all my different degrees, where they came from, what I've done with them, what type of research I've conducted, you know, different situation where it's very important as a female instructor in that type of situation that my qualifications are brought to the forefront immediately. So for a female CEO, for a female manager, if there's already some tendency to denigrate people based upon their gender, if they're female in leadership positions, then it's very important that their qualifications are publicized so that everyone knows exactly why they're qualified to do what they do. Develop the capabilities of all individuals to play leader roles. Developing your people. We talked about that in our transformational form of leadership. Grow them and move them into greater roles of responsibility. Create conditions that give leaders of both sexes equal chances to succeed. Again, emphasizing not only task accomplishment, group cohesiveness, development subordinates, you know, more and more beyond just did you do A, B, and C as far as tasks go. Confront beliefs that you do not have what it takes to be a great leader and prove them wrong. Again, remember that women frequently believe themselves that they cannot accomplish and become leaders. And it's difficult if there's never been a female in a leadership role. There's no role models. Again, I mean, how many females in our class think that they could go be president of the United States? Because we've never had one. So again, you need to confront this head on. Maybe we've never had a vice president who's female, but that doesn't mean we can't. As long as you're qualified, you know, this is what you need to do. Get out and get this experience. Do this, do that. Make a path from this, frequently called a career path, so that your people believe that they can achieve it. And if you are the first woman to hold a particular leader position, take advantage of that as being seen as a symbol for change, and to be an inspiration to other females, and quite frankly to males, to say, see that women can do this, and you know, to the females, that yes, you can aspire to also be in a leadership position. And how can you get there? Well, this is how I got there. This is how you can get there. Remember, that is a transformational idea rather than transactional. And transactional, zero sum on the power. Remember, one little person at the tippy top and no room for anyone else. Whereas transformational says, yes, there is room for all of us to develop and grow, and we will give you the chance to develop these leadership skills, rather than we will hold you back for them so that you can't topple us off the top of the pyramid. Some tasks, some terms for you to go over. Make sure you know all these terms and how they relate to leadership. And that's it for chapter 6.